There's something unsettling about driving at night. The empty roads, the shadows that twist and stretch just beyond your headlights, the silence that clings to the air, thick and heavy. You tell yourself it's just the quiet, just the dark, but deep down, you know better. Tonight we're diving into 3 terrifying true stories where simple night drives turned into nightmares, encounters with the unknown, roads that lead to nowhere, and shadows that follow you home. But beware, the last story is the most disturbing of all. So buckle up, keep your eyes on the road, and whatever you do, don't look in the rearview mirror. It was a cold, moonless night when Alex found himself driving down a deserted highway. He had been on the road for hours, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of tires against asphalt, the only sounds keeping him company. The clock on the dashboard glowed faintly, reading 11:47 p.m. Alex rubbed his tired eyes and took a sip of lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. He was exhausted, but he was determined to make it home. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by dense woods on either side. The trees seemed to lean in, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Alex shivered, though the heater in his car was blasting warm air. He had taken this route countless times before, but tonight felt different. The darkness seemed heavier, the silence more oppressive. As he rounded a bend, his headlights caught something on the side of the road. A figure. Alex slowed down, squinting through the windshield. It was a young woman, dressed in a white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her hair was wet, clinging to her face, and she was barefoot despite the cold. She raised a hand, signaling for him to stop. Alex hesitated. Something about her made his skin crawl, but he couldn't just leave her there. He pulled over and rolled down the passenger side window. "Hey, you okay? Need a ride?" he called out. The woman nodded silently and opened the door. She slid into the passenger seat, her movements slow and deliberate. Alex glanced at her as she fastened her seatbelt. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were fixed straight ahead. She didn't say a word. "Where are you headed?" Alex asked, trying to break the silence. "Blackwood," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just a few miles down the road." Alex nodded and pulled back onto the highway. The car felt colder now, as if the heater had stopped working. He glanced at the woman again. Her dress was soaked and water dripped onto the seat, pooling at her feet. "You're soaked," he said, trying to sound casual. "Did you get caught in the rain?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head slowly to look at him. Her eyes were hollow, empty, and her lips were blue, as if she'd been out in the cold for hours. Alex's stomach churned. He focused on the road, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The minutes dragged on, the silence in the car growing heavier. Alex tried to make small talk, but the woman only responded in monosyllables. Her voice was faint, almost as if it were coming from far away. He glanced at the clock. It was now 12:03 a.m. The road ahead was empty, the trees pressing in on either side. The woman's presence was unnerving, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finally, he saw a sign up ahead. "Welcome to Blackwood." Relief washed over him. "We're almost there," he said, forcing a smile. "Where exactly do you need to go?" The woman didn't respond. Alex glanced at her and froze. Her seat was empty. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. His heart pounded as he looked around the car. She was gone. The passenger seat was dry, as if no one had ever been there. Alex's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice shaking. He got out of the car, his breath visible in the cold night air. The road was empty, the woods silent. There was no sign of the woman. Alex's mind raced. Had he imagined her? No, she had been real. He had seen her, spoken to her. He got back into the car, his heart still racing. He couldn't explain what had just happened, but he knew he needed to get out of there. As he drove into Blackwood, he noticed a small house on the side of the road. A light was on in the window, and an elderly woman stood on the porch, watching him. Alex pulled over, his curiosity getting the better of him. He stepped out of the car and approached the woman. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice shaky. I think I just saw something strange." The elderly woman studied him for a moment, her eyes filled with sadness. "You saw her, didn't you?" she said softly. Alex's blood ran cold. "Who?" "Emily," the woman replied. "My daughter. She died 10 years ago. She was hit by a car on that road." Alex's knees went weak. "But I saw her. She was in my car. She told me she was going to Blackwood." The woman nodded. "You're not the first person to see her. She's been hitchhiking on that road ever since she died. She's trying to come home." Alex stared at her, his mind reeling. He didn't know what to say. The woman handed him a photograph. It was the same girl he had picked up, her face frozen in time. Alex's hands trembled as he handed the photo back. I'm sorry," he stammered. The woman smiled sadly. "Don't be. You gave her a ride. That's more than most people would do." Alex got back into his car and drove away, his mind racing. He never took that road again. But to this day, he can't shake the memory of the girl in the white dress. Her hollow eyes staring straight ahead, her voice a faint whisper in the darkness. And sometimes, when he's driving late at night, he swears he sees her standing on the side of the road, her hand raised, waiting for someone to stop. It was a quiet, uneventful night when Sarah found herself driving home from a late shift at work. The clock on her dashboard read 1:23 a.m., and the highway was eerily empty. The only sound was the hum of her car's engine and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. Sarah had taken this route countless times before, but tonight felt different. The darkness seemed heavier, the silence more oppressive. She turned up the radio, hoping to drown out the unsettling feeling creeping up her spine. As she drove, her headlights cut through the thick fog that had rolled in, casting an eerie glow on the road ahead. The trees on either side of the highway loomed like shadowy giants, their branches reaching out as if trying to grab her. Sarah tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a pair of headlights in the distance. But when she looked again, they were gone. She shook her head, trying to shake off the unease. "Just your imagination," she muttered to herself. But as she rounded a bend, the headlights reappeared, brighter this time. A large semi-truck was now behind her, its high beams blinding in her rearview mirror. Sarah squinted, trying to see the driver, but the truck's cab was too high and the windows were tinted black. The truck was gaining on her fast. Sarah's heart began to race as she pressed down on the accelerator, trying to put some distance between herself and the massive vehicle. But no matter how fast she went, the truck stayed right on her tail, its headlights flooding her car with light. She could feel the vibrations of its engine through her seat, the low rumble growing louder and more menacing. "What the hell is this guy's problem?" Sarah muttered, her hands tightening on the wheel. She glanced at the speedometer. She was already going 80 miles per hour, well over the speed limit, but the truck showed no signs of backing off. If anything, it was getting closer. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't pull over. There were no exits for miles, and the thought of stopping on this desolate stretch of road terrified her. She tried to stay calm, focusing on the road ahead, but the truck's presence was overwhelming. It was as if the driver was trying to intimidate her, to force her off the road. And then, the truck did something even more terrifying. It swerved into the lane beside her, pulling up alongside her car. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she glanced to her left. The truck's cab was level with her window, and, for the first time, she could see the driver. Or rather, she couldn't see him. The tinted windows obscured his face, but she could feel his gaze on her, cold and unrelenting. The truck's engine roared as it matched her speed, staying perfectly parallel to her car. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to slow down, hoping the truck would pass her, but it slowed down too, staying right beside her. She tried to speed up, but the truck kept pace, its massive frame looming over her like a predator. And then, she saw it. On the side of the truck, painted in faded, peeling letters, were the words, "Do not follow." Sarah's blood ran cold. What did that mean? Was it a warning? A threat? She didn't have time to think. The truck suddenly swerved toward her, forcing her to slam on the brakes. Her car skidded to a halt, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The truck roared past her, its taillights disappearing into the fog. Sarah sat there for a moment, her hands trembling on the wheel, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She looked around, half expecting the truck to come back, but the road was empty. The silence was deafening. She didn't know what to do. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around, to go back the way she came, but she was too far from the last exit. She had no choice but to keep going. Slowly, she pulled back onto the road, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The truck was gone, but the fear it had left behind lingered. As she drove, the fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Sarah's heart was still racing, her mind replaying the encounter over and over. What had just happened? Who was that driver, and why had the truck been following her? She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't see the figure standing in the middle of the road. Her headlights caught a glimpse of a man in tattered clothes, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. Sarah swerved to avoid him, her car skidding off the road and into the ditch. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and for a moment she sat there, dazed and disoriented. When she finally caught her breath, she looked around. The man was gone. The road was empty. The fog had lifted, and the night was eerily quiet. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her phone, but there was no signal. She was completely alone. She didn't know how long she sat there, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. But eventually, she forced herself to start the car and pull back onto the road. She drove slowly, her eyes darting to every shadow, every movement. The truck was gone, but the memory of it haunted her. When she finally made it home, she called the police, but they found nothing. No truck, no man, no explanation. To this day, Sarah doesn't know what happened that night. But she never drives that stretch of highway again. And if she ever sees a black semi-truck with the words, "Do not follow," painted on the side, she knows better than to ignore the warning. It was a night like any other when Mark decided to take a shortcut home. He had been visiting a friend in a nearby town, and the GPS had suggested a route he'd never taken before. The road was narrow and winding, cutting through a dense forest that seemed to stretch on forever. The clock on his dashboard read 2:17 a.m., and the only light came from his headlights, which barely pierced the thick fog that had settled over the road. Mark wasn't usually one to get nervous, but something about this road felt off. The trees seemed to loom closer than they should, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The fog was so thick that he could barely see 10 feet ahead, and the GPS had stopped working entirely, its screen flickering before going completely blank. "Great," Mark muttered, tapping the screen uselessly. "Just great." He considered turning around, but he was already deep into the forest, and the thought of navigating the winding road in reverse was even more unsettling. He decided to keep going, hoping the road would eventually lead him back to civilization. But as the minutes dragged on, he began to realize something was terribly wrong. The road didn't end. No matter how far he drove, it just kept going, twisting and turning through the endless forest. The trees seemed to close in around him, their shadows dancing in the fog. The clock on his dashboard had stopped working too, frozen at 2:17 a.m. Mark's unease grew with every mile. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. And then he saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible in the glow of his headlights. Mark slowed down, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure was a man, dressed in tattered clothes, his face pale and gaunt. He raised a hand, signaling for Mark to stop. Mark hesitated. Everything about this situation screamed danger, but the man looked desperate, his eyes wide with fear. Against his better judgment, Mark rolled down the window. "Hey, you okay?" he called out. The man didn't respond. He just stared at Mark, his mouth moving silently as if he were trying to say something but couldn't. Mark's skin crawled. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice trembling. The man suddenly lunged forward, his face pressing against the window. Mark screamed and slammed on the gas, the car lurching forward. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the man was gone. The road behind him was empty. Mark's heart was racing, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He tried to calm himself down, but the fear was overwhelming. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was out there in the fog, waiting for him. The road continued to stretch on, endless and unchanging. Mark's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He had been driving for what felt like hours, but the road showed no signs of ending. The trees seemed to close in around him, their shadows growing darker, more menacing. The fog thickened, reducing visibility to almost nothing. And then he heard it. A voice, faint and distorted, like a radio signal cutting in and out. It was coming from inside the car, but there was no one else there. Mark's blood ran cold as the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Turn back. You don't belong here." Mark slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. He looked around, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The voice was gone, but the fear it had left behind lingered. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't keep driving. The road seemed to go on forever. But he couldn't turn around either. The thought of going back the way he came filled him with dread. He sat there for what felt like hours, his mind racing, his heart pounding. The fog seemed to close in around him, suffocating him, and then he saw it again. The man. He was standing in the middle of the road, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the man raised a hand, pointing to something behind him. Mark turned around, his heart pounding. The road behind him was gone. In its place was a dense wall of trees, their branches reaching out like claws. The fog seemed to thicken, swallowing everything in its path. Mark's hands trembled as he realized he was trapped. The man suddenly appeared at his window, his face pressed against the glass. Mark screamed and slammed on the gas, the car lurching forward. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to get out of there. The road twisted and turned, the trees closing in around him. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to almost nothing. And then he saw it. A light. Faint and flickering, like a distant fire. Mark's heart leaped with hope as he drove toward it, the car bouncing over the uneven road. The light grew brighter, more intense, until it was blinding. Mark shielded his eyes, his hands trembling on the wheel. When the light faded, he was back on the highway, the forest gone, the fog lifted. The clock on his dashboard read 2:17 a.m., just like before. Mark's hands shook as he pulled over to the side of the road, his mind reeling. He didn't know what had just happened. He didn't know where he had been or how he had gotten out. But he knew one thing for sure. He would never take that road again. To this day, Mark refuses to talk about what happened that night. But sometimes, when he's driving late at night, he swears he sees the man standing on the side of the road, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. And he knows better than to stop. And there you have it, 3 chilling night drive stories that will make you think twice before hitting the road after dark. From vanishing hitchhikers to endless roads and trucks that shouldn't exist, these tales remind us that sometimes the scariest things aren't in the shadows. They're right in front of us. But here's the thing. These stories aren't just meant to scare you. They're a reminder that the world is full of mysteries we can't explain. So the next time you're driving at night and you see something strange in your rearview mirror, don't ignore it, because you never know what might be waiting for you. If these stories gave you chills, don't forget to hit that like button and let me know in the comments which one scared you the most. Was it the hitchhiker, the truck, or the road that never ended? Share this video with your friends who love a good scare, and make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a spine-tingling story. Thanks for watching, and remember, if you hear a knock at your door or see something strange on the road, keep your wits about you. Stay curious, stay scared, and I'll see you in the next video.